Welcome to Consciousness and the Bicameral Mind, the Julian Jaynes Society podcast. Learn more about Julian Jaynes' theory or become a member by visiting the Julian Jaynes Society at www.julianjaynes.org. Consciousness and Bicameral Mentality. A deep dive discussion exploring Julian Jaynes' theory. Produced by Camille Tillier.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into fascinating source material to unearth the most compelling insights just for you.
Glad to be diving in.
Today, we're tackling something truly monumental. A theory that really challenges almost everything we thought we knew about the human mind and its history.
Absolutely. It's a big one.
We're embarking on an extensive deep dive into Julian Jaynes' groundbreaking work, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind.
And it's not just Jaynes' original book, is it? We've also pulled in a whole wealth of research, articles, discussions, interviews from the Julian Jaynes Society.
That's right. Featuring scholars who are really carrying the torch, people like Brian McVeigh, Marcel Quaiston, Rabbi James Cohn, Jan Slutels, Boban Dedovich, Michael Carr, Todd Gibson, Franco Rodriguez.
These are the folks actively exploring, testing, and, expanding on Jaynes' pretty audacious ideas today.
Our mission today is clear. We want to go deep, really deep. We're going to explore the core claims of this theory, look closely at the evidence Jaynes and the society present, and its wide-ranging evidence, from ancient texts, archaeology, even modern neuroscience.
Yeah, pulls from everywhere.
And we really want to grapple with its profoundly disruptive implications. Across psychology, neuroscience, anthropology, history, and maybe, most startlingly, for our own sense of self.
You see, the standard view, the one we're all pretty comfortable with, right, is that consciousness, that subjective inner feeling of me having thoughts, feelings, making decisions, it's just, us.
It's just how humans are.
Exactly. Innate, biological, something Homo sapiens has always had. But Jaynes argues, and with considerable force, that this just isn't the case. He thinks it's a profoundly historical phenomenon. It hasn't always been here.
Which means we have to be prepared for some, let's say, intellectual turbulence today. Jaynes' ideas don't just tweak existing models. They pretty much overturn some deeply ingrained assumptions.
It could be jarring, definitely.
But if you stick with us, we think you'll find it's an incredibly illuminating journey. So let's buckle up and unpack this really revolutionary perspective on human mentality.
Okay, so at the absolute heart of Jaynes' theory is this assertion that the human mind hasn't just existed in one state, but in two fundamentally distinct states, or epochs, over its history.
Two fundamentally distinct states. Okay, right there, that's the first radical claim, isn't it? What are these two states?
Well, there's the state we inhabit now, which Jaynes defines very, very precisely as consciousness. And then there's the state that existed before it, the one he calls the bicameral mind.
Okay, so let's start with the one we think we know, consciousness. Because as you said, Jaynes' definition isn't just that fuzzy feeling most of us mean when we say, I'm conscious. He's much more rigorous about it.
Yeah, and that precision is absolutely vital for understanding the whole theory. For Jaynes, consciousness isn't simply being awake or responsive to stimuli, no. It is specifically what is introspectable.
Introspective.
Yes. It's that subjective internal experience. You have the feeling of having an inner world that you can mentally look into, explore, kind of manipulate things within.
The feeling of an inner world. Okay, so that kind of introspection, it must require specific mental machinery, right? It doesn't just happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Jaynes breaks this down into several key components that he argues are actually learned. They're not innate.
Yeah.
The first is what he calls the analog I.
The analog I.
Yeah, it's a mental construct of the self. Think of it like an internal protagonist, a character named me or I, who exists and acts within this inner world we perceive.
Yeah.
It's like you're the narrator and the main character of your own internal story all at once.
A constructed character, not just me. That immediately feels kind of weird, counterintuitive.
It absolutely is, and that's central to his point. Jaynes is saying the sense of I isn't a biological given. It's something we build up culturally and linguistically. And this analog I navigates within what he terms a mind space.
Mind space, like an inner landscape.
Sort of, yeah. It's a metaphorical, spatialized model of reality that you construct internally. It's the place where your analog eye can mentally move around, interact with mental objects like ideas or memories, visualize scenarios, or mentally rehearse actions before you do them. Think about when you say you'll place something in the back of your mind, or you need to grapple with an idea or look at a problem from a different angle. You're constantly using spatial metaphors to describe internal, non-spatial processes.
So we take external physical concepts like space and movement, and we basically apply them inward to create this internal stage for the eye to perform on.
Precisely. And how is this mind space created and populated with these mental objects, these ideas and memories? Jaynes argues it's fundamentally built upon metaphorical language. We use language to draw analogies from the physical world, from our bodies, from external actions, and we apply them to abstract mental concepts. You know, like we just said, quick mind, being broad-minded, the back of the mind, the mind's eye, wrestling with an idea. Language, in this really revolutionary view, isn't just a tool for communicating outward, it's actually seen as an organ of perception, actively shaping how we experience and structure our internal reality.
Language as an organ of perception.
Wow.
That's a really powerful reframing. Okay, so this metaphorical language, this internal space, it allows for something else we totally take for granted, what Jaynes calls narratization.
Yes, exactly. Narratization. It's the ongoing, often completely automatic process of creating a story of the self moving through time. We are constantly narrating our lives to ourselves, aren't we? Explaining why we did something, predicting what we might do next, rationalizing our actions, often after the fact.
Making sense of it all.
Right. And this involves selectively perceiving situations, assigning causes and reasons, whether they're actually accurate or not. Consciousness is always ready with an explanation, a story, even if it's, well, sometimes a bit of a fabrication to maintain that sense of coherence.
And this internal narrative playing out within that mind space, it also allows us to do something amazing with time, right? To kind of spatialize it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
We can project ourselves into the future, mentally running through possibilities within our inner theater. What if I do this? What happens next? And we can also look back and organize the past into a coherent story, giving it a temporal structure we can navigate, reflect upon, learn from. Jaynes actually suggests this is why history as a conscious discipline, you know, with people like Herodotus and Chester Starr trying to create a spatialized timeline of past events, really emerges around the same time he proposes this mental shift to consciousness occurred. Before that, the past wasn't structured in the same narrative way.
Interesting link. And consciousness also adds another layer to emotions.
Right, what he calls a conscious tier of emotion. We have fundamental non-conscious emotions, fear, shame, anger, the drive to affiliate, things like that. But consciousness acts upon these. It processes them, integrates them into the self-narrative, allows for much more complex emotional responses, interpretations, feelings about feelings.
And with all this, the analog eye, mind space, narratization, spatialized time, complex emotions, with this conscious interiority comes the development of abilities like insight, right? Self-objectivity.
Yes, that ability to mentally step back and look at yourself, almost as another person, like a character in your own narrative, and self-correction, based on reviewing those past scenes in your mind space. And crucially, what Jaynes calls self-authorization.
Self-authorization, meaning?
Meaning the feeling, the conviction that you, the analog eye, are the source of your decisions and your volitional behavior, that the commands come from within, not from some external force or voice.
Okay. Now, here's where Jaynes really throws down the gauntlet to standard psychological thinking, isn't it? He argues, forcefully, with tons of evidence we'll get into, that consciousness, as he's just defined it with all these features, it is not an innate biological trait hardwired into the brain from birth.
Correct. And it's not an inevitable outcome of biological evolution.
Wait, so that feeling of me inside my head, the voice I hear when I think, this whole inner world, you're saying, Jaynes says, that's learned. It's not just there when we're born.
Exactly. That's the core disruptive claim. Jaynes calls it a cultural add-on. It's a learned process, entirely dependent on specific cultural and linguistic developments that happened historically.
So it piggybacks on our biology, but isn't biology itself.
Precisely. It's built upon our biological capacity for language and spatial cognition, sure. But the structure of consciousness itself, the analog eye, the mind space, the narratization that is acquired through interaction with an already conscious culture, through learning the specific metaphorical language that builds mind space and the narrative structures that build the analog eye.
Wow. It's like learning an incredibly complex skill. But the skill is your entire subjective reality.
That's a great way to put it. And researchers like Marcel Keiston and Brian McVeigh have elaborated on this. They talk about consciousness relying on exogenetic information. information external to the genes, like culture, language, stories, laws. This leads to a kind of virtual evolution, a change in mentality driven by cultural transmission, not slow genetic mutation.
And that implies something really provocative, that consciousness isn't necessarily the same for everyone.
Exactly. It implies consciousness is variably distributed within a society. The depth, the complexity, the very nature of conscious interiority might differ between individuals depending on their upbringing, their cultural immersion, the linguistic tools they acquire. It's not an on-off switch. It's more like a spectrum shaped by learning.
Okay, so consciousness, in Jaynes's view. Complex, metaphorical, narrative, introspective, learned, and culturally dependent. That completely flips the script. If that's our current state, what on earth was the human mind like before this emerged? This brings us to the bicameral mind.
Right, the bicameral mind. This is Jaynes's term for the state of human mentality that he argues existed for the vast majority of human history. From maybe the emergence of language, perhaps 50,000 or even 100,000 years ago, right up until a pretty dramatic breakdown period, roughly around 3,000 years ago.
So most of Homo sapiens' time on Earth.
Likely, yes. And this was, in his view, a preconscious state.
Preconscious, meaning it lacked all those components we just spent time defining. No analog eye, no mind space.
Exactly. According to Jaynes, there was no introspection as we know it, no subjective self-awareness, no analog eye character narrating internally, no internal mind space to navigate, and no ongoing self-narratization or rationalization.
Okay, so how did they function? I mean, how did they make decisions, especially in new situations or complex ones, if they weren't deliberating internally, should I do this or that? What guided them?
Okay, now we get to the most striking, and for many people, the most difficult part of the theory to really grasp. Jaynes's core claim is that decisions and any non-habitual behavior were directly guided by auditory hallucinations.
Hallucinations, like literally hearing voices that weren't there.
Yes, but, and this is absolutely crucial, not experienced as pathological or as symptoms of illness the way we might view them today. In the bicameral world, Jaynes argues, these voices were experienced as utterly real, external, and completely authoritative. They were perceived as the voices of gods, or dead ancestors, or tribal chiefs, or even personal guardian deities.
So instead of an internal thought process like, should I go left or right down this path? Let's weigh the pros and cons. They would literally hear a voice in their head sound external saying, go left.
Precisely. For bicameral people, Jaynes states, volition was synonymous with hearing and obeying these neurological commands. There was no internal deliberation, no subjective weighing of options, no choice in our modern conscious sense of the word. They heard the voice, and that voice was the command, the decision, the irresistible impetus to act.
That's almost impossible for us from our perspective to conceive of, a mind without internal debate or second guessing.
It is profoundly alien to our experience. And Jaynes proposed a specific neurological model for how this might have actually worked in the brain. He argued that the two hemispheres of the brain, while connected by the corpus callosum, operated in a more functionally dependent or perhaps less integrated relationship compared to how they work in conscious individuals today.
How so?
He hypothesized that the right hemisphere, particularly areas homologous to our language centers, like the right Wernicke's area, was the source of these God voices. The right brain, often associated with more synthetic, spatial, holistic processing, generated the directives, the commands.
Okay. The right brain speaks.
And the left hemisphere, which he sometimes called the man part, the side typically dominant for language production and sequential processing, was the receiving end. It was responsible for verbal tasks and for executing these perceived commands that came across from the other side. The voice would travel across the neural pathways, the corpus callosum, connecting the hemispheres.
So almost like one side of the brain was the God giving orders and the other side was the human hearing and obeying.
In essence, yes, that's the neurological correlate Jaynes proposed for the bicameral system described in ancient texts. Now, it's absolutely vital to understand, Jaynes wasn't saying bicameral humans were simple-minded or unintelligent. Far from it.
Right, because they built civilizations.
Exactly. They built cities, developed complex agriculture, created stunning art, monumental architecture like the pyramids. Consciousness, as Jaynes defines it, that internal narratizing space is not necessary for learning complex skills or performing intricate tasks. We learn complex motor skills, conditioned responses, procedural knowledge all the time without much, or any, conscious effort or internal monologue, right?
Like riding a bike or playing an instrument once you're skilled.
Precisely. The bicameral mind was highly capable of learning, reacting effectively to its environment. Jaynes termed this perceptual reactivity, and relied heavily on unconscious processing. They could do complex things.
They could learn and react, build pyramids, but they couldn't think about their learning and reacting in the same subjective, self-aware way we can.
That's the idea. They lacked explicit conceptual thought based on introspection. Because explicit concepts, in Jaynes's view, require that internal monologue, the ability to manipulate ideas within mind space to define justice or belief internally. So they operated with what he called a preconceptual mentality. They could perceive, react, learn, build, but not in a way mediated by an internal conceptual self-aware narrative.
And this lack of an internal subjective space or a constructed self means that the very concept of mind as an internal entity simply didn't exist for them.
Correct. Jaynes did meticulous analysis of ancient languages, arguing that words we now translate as mind, soul, spirit, or consciousness in the earliest texts simply didn't carry those abstract internal meanings back then.
What do they mean?
He points to early Greek words, for example. Psyche, often translated soul, meant something closer to life substance, the breath that escapes at death. Thumos, often spirit or passion, referred to motion, physical agitation, or vital force, often explicitly located in the chest or diaphragm. Nous, sometimes mind or intellect in later Greek, originally meant perception or sight or recognition, also frequently located physically in the chest region in Homer.
So they were concrete, behavioral, physiological terms, not references to some internal subjective world.
Exactly. They described observable actions, bodily states, or perceptual events, not an inner theater of thought. And researchers like Bo Bendedovich have done fantastic work showing a similar pattern in ancient Egyptian texts. The vocabulary just doesn't map onto our modern subjective lexicon.
So crucially, this isn't just about the specific word consciousness being missing back then. It's about the absence of a whole vocabulary for describing a range of internal mental states. The whole toolkit was missing.
Precisely. It's the absence of what linguists call a psycholexicon. And Jaynes and researchers at the Julian Jaynes Society like Michael Carr studying ancient China and Todd Gibson looking at ancient Tibetan texts have shown this pattern seems to appear globally. It suggests a similar preconscious mental state existed across different cultures, although, importantly, the breakdown into consciousness seems to have happened at different times in different places.
And Rabbi James Cone found something similar in the Old Testament.
Yes, his comparisons of older books like Amos with much later books like Ecclesiastes show a clear shift in the language used to refer to internal states, thoughts, and decision-making processes. The older books lack that subjective vocabulary.
Okay, so let's recap the core idea. Two fundamentally different human mentalities. Bicameral, guided by auditory commands perceived as external God's voices, no introspection, no analog eye, no mind space, and then conscious, guided by internal deliberation and narrative within a mind space featuring an analog eye, all built on metaphor and learned culturally.
That's the framework.
If this is even remotely true, it's not just an interesting idea for a cognitive science seminar. It's profoundly disruptive to, well, pretty much everything we think we know about ourselves and our past.
Oh, it's an earthquake, a complete paradigm shift, potentially. Let's just start with psychology. Mainstream psychology has traditionally, almost universally, assumed that consciousness, our kind of subjective experience, is universal and transhistorical.
Meaning people 5,000 years ago felt internally pretty much the same way we do now, just, with spears instead of smartphones.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
That the fundamental operating system was the same. Jaynes completely demolishes this assumption. He says, no, we've only had this kind of consciousness for the last sliver of human history. For most of our time, we were fundamentally different inside.
And this immediately shifts consciousness from being seen as a biological, given something your brain just automatically does like breathing, to being a cultural construct, a learned ability built on that exogenetic information and resulting in a kind of virtual evolution.
Right. That challenges the biological reductionism you often find in psychological explanations of consciousness. It puts culture and language right at the center of how our minds work.
And it forces us to reevaluate seemingly fundamental psychological processes, doesn't it? Jaynes argues, for instance, that consciousness isn't actually necessary for perception.
That's a key point. Our eyes are constantly making tiny jumps, saccades, yet we consciously perceive a stable visual world. That stability isn't something we consciously do. It's complex, non-conscious processing happening underneath. Consciousness gets the edited highlight.
Memory, too.
Same thing. Memory isn't like a video camera faithfully recording everything. Much of what we experience isn't consciously encoded, and recall is often an active, reconstructive process happening largely outside of conscious awareness. Consciousness often just experiences the result of the recall.
In learning, you mentioned motor skills.
Right. Conditioned responses, mastering a musical instrument, driving a car, these become largely automatic, non-conscious processes. Consciousness might set the goal initially, but the execution happens without constant inner narration.
Okay, perception, memory, learning. But you're even saying thinking itself isn't necessarily conscious. That feels deeply counterintuitive. My thoughts feel like the core of my conscious self.
Jaynes argues that the vast majority of our mental functioning, our problem-solving, our reasoning, actually occurs non-consciously. He points to classic experiments like Marby's word association experiments back in the early 20th century. Subjects were asked to respond to a word with an association, and when asked how they found the word, they often reported that their minds were introspectively blank during the search. The solution just appeared.
Like a flash of insight.
Exactly. Flashes of insight, solving a problem while you're thinking about something else, suddenly understanding a joke. These aren't typically experienced as step-by-step, conscious, deliberative processes. Consciousness, Jaynes argues, often comes in later to provide the narrative explanation, the rationalization, for decisions or conclusions that were already reached non-consciously or through other bicameral-like processes.
So much of what we attribute to our conscious, self-making decisions might actually be happening without us in the driver's seat, and we just claim authorship afterwards.
That's a big part of his argument, yes.
Yeah.
And this highlights what Jaynes called the Platonic impulse, or the principle of psychological unity in traditional psychology. This deep-seated, often unconscious ahistorical bias that assumes fundamental psychological processes are consistent across all times and cultures. We project our own minds backward.
And this bias makes it incredibly difficult for mainstream psychology to even conceive of, let alone seriously study, significantly different past mentalities like the bicameral mind.
Precisely. It leads to what he called an embarrassment at the margins of the mind when confronted with phenomena like divine voices, prophecy, or possession states that don't fit neatly into our modern subjective model. We tend to explain them away psychologically rather than considering they might reflect a fundamentally different mental structure.
Okay, psychology is shaken. What about neuroscience? How does Jaynes' theory disrupt that field?
Well, for starters, it challenges the long-standing and arguably largely unsuccessful search for where in the brain consciousness resides. The hunt for the seat of consciousness.
Right, the idea that there's one specific spot or network that is consciousness.
Exactly. If consciousness isn't an innate, localized biological function, but rather a learned language-based operational system, then the search for a single consciousness center in the brain, like the reticular formation in the brainstem or some other specific neural substrate, might be fundamentally misguided.
So consciousness isn't in the brain like the visual cortex is in the occipital lobe.
Jaynes suggests it's more like software running on the hardware. It's a function of specific neural organizations and processes that develop through learning and culture, particularly those related to language, metaphor, spatialization, and the creation of that internal metaphorical space we talked about. It's about how parts of the brain learn to interact in a new way.
But he did propose a specific neurological model for the bicameral state itself, the state before consciousness, right?
Yes, absolutely. And this is quite specific and, importantly, testable, even with the limited neuroscientific tools available back in the 1970s when he wrote the book. He hypothesized that the auditory hallucinations, the God voices of the bicameral mind, originated in the right hemisphere's non-dominant language areas.
Specifically.
He pointed towards areas homologous to Wernicke's area in the left hemisphere, but on the right side, so the right temporal lobe. And these voice commands were then perceived, heard, in the left hemisphere's dominant language areas, like Wernicke's area proper, having traveled across the corpus callosum.
So a specific right-to-left pathway for the voices.
Yes. This proposed right-left interaction for auditory hallucinations was a key and predictive part of his neurological argument.
And he also drew on things like the early split-brain patient studies.
He did. He found those studies compelling because they showed that under certain conditions, surgically separating the hemispheres could lead to them acting with a striking degree of independence, almost like two separate minds or at least operating systems in one skull. This provided a potential neural analogy, or basis, for a relationship similar to the man-god dynamic he saw in ancient texts, one side generating commands or actions, the other receiving and acting, sometimes with limited awareness crossing between them.
And the observed functional differences between the hemispheres that were known even then.
Right. The right hemisphere's apparent strengths in spatial processing, pattern recognition, holistic understanding that seemed to align, for Jaynes, with the kind of synthetic, all-at-once commands a guiding voice might give. Go there, build this. And the left hemisphere's known strengths in verbal processing, analytical tasks, and sequential action fit the role of the receiver and executor of those commands.
Okay, and finally, the brain's plasticity.
Crucial. The understanding, even then, that the brain is significantly plastic, that its structure and function can be profoundly organized and shaped by environmental input, by learning, by culture, this supported the core Jaynesian idea that a fundamental mental restructuring, like the proposed shift from bicameralism to consciousness, could be a learned cultural phenomenon. It didn't have to rely solely on slow, gradual genetic evolution changing the hardware. The software could change dramatically.
Okay, so psychology and neuroscience are definitely challenged. And then there's the impact on anthropology and history. You mentioned the presentist fallacy.
Yes. Jaynes' theory completely overturns that fallacy, the common, often unconscious error of assuming ancient peoples had minds just like ours, and projecting our modern subjectivity onto their actions, texts, and artifacts.
So interpreting ancient myths or rituals as if they were created by people with modern psychological motivations.
Exactly. Jaynes argues this changes everything about how we interpret the past. He posits a profound historical discontinuity in human mentality. The shift from bicameralism to consciousness wasn't just a minor tweak or gradual evolution of the same basic mental processes. It was a radical, qualitative transformation, a different operating system entirely.
Which means ancient history wasn't lived by people like us, just with less technology and different beliefs?
No, it was lived by people with fundamentally different mental operating systems. And this requires a radical reinterpretation of ancient history.
How so? What specifically needs reinterpreting?
Well, think about early religions, the ubiquitous gods, the idols, the complex rituals, the structure of theocratic states. Jaynes argues these weren't just symbolic representations or philosophical constructs developed by conscious minds trying to explain the world the way modern theology or sociology might see them.
They were direct results of the bicameral mind.
Yes, they were direct manifestations of a hallucinatory, commandment-based mental system. The gods weren't just believed in, they were literally heard. The idols weren't just representations, they were often perceived as the actual speaking vessels of divine authority, the source of the commands. Early religions were, in essence, codified systems for mediating, interpreting, and reinforcing these auditory commands that structured society. This radically reinterprets the very nature of ancient civilization itself.
Okay, this is fascinating, incredibly challenging, and I have to admit, a little hard to swallow just hearing it laid out. It's such a different picture of humanity. So, where is the evidence? You said Jaynes spent hundreds of pages building his case. Let's dig into his actual demonstrations. Maybe start with the literary evidence, what he called the philology of the bicameral.
Yes, this is often where Jaynes is seen as being at his most persuasive, his most detailed, his most fairest comparison, and probably the best place to start is between Homer's two great epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Okay, and the argument is they show a transition.
Exactly. He argues the Iliad, which most scholars agree is the older text, depicts a world populated predominantly by bicameral minds, whereas the Odyssey, likely composed centuries later, shows clear signs of the emergence of subjective consciousness as we know it.
How does he actually show this through the text itself? What's the difference?
It comes down to analyzing the language used, and especially the portrayal of character motivation and decision-making. In the Iliad, Jaynes points out, characters consistently do not introspect. They don't describe weighing options internally, they don't debate with themselves, they don't reflect on their feelings, or make decisions based on a subjective thought process playing out in their minds.
So how do they make decisions or take action?
Overwhelmingly, their significant actions, especially deviations from normal behavior or moments of high stress or courage, are initiated directly by the voices and commands of the gods.
Can you give a concrete example from the poem?
Absolutely. Think of a scene, and there are many, where a warrior, maybe Achilles or Diomedes, is in battle, perhaps faltering or about to make a choice. Suddenly a god or goddess, like Athena or Apollo, appears often visible or audible only to that specific hero and gives them a direct command. Attack now. Hold back. Go help Patroclus. And the warrior's action follows immediately, without any depicted internal deliberation. There's no passage where Homer describes the hero thinking, Athena just told me to charge that whole battalion. Is that wise? What are the potential consequences? How do I feel about risking my life right now? No. The volition, the impulse to act, is the divine command, heard and obeyed instantly. There's simply no concept depicted of an internal ego or self making a choice independent of that external sounding voice.
And the language itself reflects this lack of interiority.
Yes, consistently. As we touched on briefly before, Jaynes meticulously shows that words we later translate as having internal mental meanings like psyche, soul, thumos, spirit, passion, nous, mind, intellect, in the Iliad, consistently have concrete external behavioral or physiological meanings.
Remind us again, psyche was.
Psyche is the life substance, like a puff of breath, that escapes the body at death. Thumos is motion, agitation, the surge of energy or emotion located physically in the chest, like a physical force you feel. Nous is perception, specifically sight or recognition, like recognizing someone on the battlefield, also frequently located physically in the chest or thumos region. It can be described with physical adjectives. You can have a fearless nous or a strong nous. When Zeus is said to keep Hector in his nous, it means he keeps him in his sight or his regard, not in his mind, in our abstract sense.
So basically, no internal thought process is described, and the very words that later come to mean inner states don't actually mean inner states yet in the Iliad.
Precisely. Jaynes argues there are virtually no instances of clear subjectification or introspection in the Iliad. The few possible ambiguous lines, like one where Achilles' mother Thetis asks him why grief has come upon his phrens, his midriff chest area, and tells him not to conceal it in nous, asking him to speak it aloud so both may know. Jaynes sees these as the absolute earliest faint flickers of this new way of thinking, maybe the very beginning of trying to articulate an inner state. But they are extremely rare anomalies compared to the overwhelming pattern of action driven by external divine command.
Okay, that's the Iliad. How does the Odyssey contrast with that picture?
Well, by the time the Odyssey is composed, perhaps centuries later, we encounter a fundamentally different kind of protagonist, Odysseus himself. Odysseus is constantly internalizing, deliberating, planning, deceiving, reflecting on his own subjective state. He worries, he plots, he talks to himself, he weighs options in his mind.
He sounds much more like a modern character.
Exactly. Jaynes says Odysseus constantly frets over and narratizes every aspect of his life. His entire journey is explicitly framed by Jaynes not just as a physical journey home, but as an odyssey towards subjective identity. A psychological journey, a transition from being a figure whose actions were often dictated by external forces. Jaynes colorfully calls the earlier heroes like Achilles almost will-less gigolos of a divinity, to becoming a self-determining, internally motivated agent. Odysseus becomes, in the modern subjective sense, Odysseus.
Because he lies, he plots, he has internal dilemmas.
Yes, he lies strategically, he concocts elaborate plans in his mind, he grapples with internal conflicts, and makes conscious choices based on his own calculated self-interest or goals, all things the characters in the Iliad simply do not do in the same way. The difference in the portrayal of the central character's mental life is stark.
That comparison alone is really striking, but Jaynes argues this pattern isn't just limited to ancient Greece, right? He looks elsewhere.
No, absolutely not. He finds equally compelling, though perhaps harder to decipher, evidence in the ancient Near East as well. Particularly in Mesopotamia, the Sumerian and Babylonian civilizations, with their cuneiform writings going back to around 3000 BC.
And you mentioned translation challenges there.
Yes, huge challenges. Because scholars translating these ancient texts are, of course, modern conscious individuals. There's a very strong, often unconscious tendency to read our own subjective experience and psychological assumptions back into the texts, to translate ancient words using modern psychological vocabulary. This makes objective interpretation extremely difficult. Jaynes spent a lot of time arguing against these anachronistic translations.
Yet even through that potentially distorting lens, the texts still seem to describe a world deeply concerned with the will of the gods.
Absolutely. They describe a world where gods express their will through words, the Akkadian word amatu, and through commandments kibitu. These terms appear constantly in relation to divine action.
And society itself was structured around this.
Very much so. Early Mesopotamian society was structured as a strict theocracy, but not a theocracy where the god is an abstract principle represented by a human king. No, the gods themselves were considered the true citizens and the actual rulers of the city-states. The human kings were merely stewards, intermediaries, whose primary job was to ascertain and carry out the god's will.
How did they do that? How did the king know the god's will?
Primarily through receiving auditory commands, often in dreams, but also through various divinatory practices interpreted as messages from the gods. The king had to constantly consult the deities for governing decisions, for building projects, for going to war. The authority wasn't his. It belonged to the god whose voice he channeled.
And you mentioned earlier it wasn't just the king hearing voices. Everyone had a personal god.
Yes, that seems to have been a core part of Mesopotamian religious life. Each person, or at least each head of household, apparently had a personal god or goddess, their Ili or Iltu, who acted as a kind of divine guide and protector. And the texts reflect this intimate relationship. Mesopotamians were constantly admonished in wisdom literature to pay heed to the word of thy mother as the word of thy God, and to wholeheartedly obey the command of his God. These weren't just pious metaphors. They seem to have been practical directives for daily life, implying a voice that could be heard and needed to be obeyed.
And the most striking evidence for this personal connection.
Perhaps the fact that we have actual letters written on clay tablets addressed directly to personal gods. People wrote letters to their gods, asking for guidance, pleading for help, sometimes even complaining about misfortune, strongly suggesting the god was perceived not as an abstract entity, but as a real, listening, communicating presence capable of receiving and responding to these messages, like talking to an invisible but very real authority figure.
A letter to your personal god. That really brings the perceived reality of this external voice home, doesn't it?
It does. And crucially, Jaynes argues we can also trace the transition away from this state in later Mesopotamian texts, mirroring the Iliad to Odyssey shift.
Like in Hammurabi's code.
Yes, the famous Law Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a large stone stele around 1750 BC, is interpreted by Jaynes as showing signs of, well, perhaps separate mental organizations starting to interact, or maybe the beginnings of internal conflict, or different voices within the system.
How so?
He points to the difference between the boastful, rather self-congratulatory prologue and epilogue, where Hammurabi talks about his own greatness and achievements, and the main body of the text, which consists of detailed legal judgments presented as commands dictated directly by the god Marduk. Jaynes provocatively suggests the prologue might be products of the left hemisphere, perhaps the nascent man part developing a sense of personal pride in authorship. But the authoritative legal judgments themselves still represent directives perceived as coming from the god, potentially originating from the right hemisphere. Jaynes argues neither section was consciously authored in our modern sense. They reflect a mental system still operating through distinct, differently attributed sources of verbal output.
Okay, so signs of a split even then. And does this breakdown, this fading of the clear god voices, become more apparent over time in Mesopotamia?
Yes, Jaynes traces this further. For example, in texts like the Epic of Tukulti-Ninurta, dating from around 1200 BC onwards, the gods start to be depicted differently. They become angry, sometimes seemingly capricious, or are described as abandoning cities or kings. This suggests, Jaynes argues, a weakening of their constant, clear, authoritative presence. The connection is becoming unreliable.
And by the later Assyrian period?
By the time we get to the 7th century BC in Assyria, the nature of the surviving texts, like state letters found in royal archives, reveals a very different world. It's a world suddenly full of deceit and divination, police investigations, mentions of bribery, paranoid fears of hidden enemies, and conspiracies, things Jaynes claims were unknown, unmentioned, and impossible in the straightforward, command-based world of Hammurabi's time centuries earlier.
Why impossible?
Because complex deceit, paranoia about hidden motives, the need for police investigations, these rely on the existence of subjective minds capable of hiding intentions, plotting in secret, and interpreting the ambiguous actions of other subjective minds. Jaynes argues this shift in textual content reflects the emergence of a conscious, subjective world where humans must navigate uncertainty, the potential treachery of other conscious individuals, and rely increasingly on complex divination rituals to replace the lost certainty of direct divine command. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though compiled relatively late, around 650 BC, is interesting because it seems to contain elements weaving together both earlier, more bicameral elements like direct conversations with gods, and later more conscious perspectives, like Gilgamesh's very personal grief and quest for immortality, reflecting perhaps that long transitional period.
Fascinating. Jaynes also applied this lens to ancient Egypt, didn't he?
Yes, he did. The hieroglyphics and the later hieratic script, going back to around 3000 BC, present similar translation challenges as cuneiform, the risk of projecting modern consciousness onto ancient minds.
And he had a specific interpretation of the Egyptian concept of the Ka.
Yes, the Ka is often translated very vaguely as spirit, double, or willpower. Jaynes offered a much more concrete bicameral interpretation. He noted the hieroglyphic symbol for the Ka features a pair of uplifted arms, often placed on the type of stand used to display images of divinities.
Okay.
Based on its function in texts and iconography, Jaynes argues the Ka was essentially the Egyptian equivalent of the bicameral voice. An articulate directing voice, heard inwardly, perhaps often perceived in the familiar accents of parents or revered ancestors, functioning as a personal guide and source of commands, analogous to the Mesopotamian Ili or personal god.
And this interpretation connects with how the Ka is treated in relation to death, like in the pyramid texts.
It's exactly. The famous pyramid texts from the Old Kingdom around 2200 BC contain spells aimed at ensuring the deceased pharaoh's successful transition to the afterlife. They referred to the dead pharaohs becoming masters of their Kas. Jaynes sees this as supporting the idea that this internalized guiding voice, the Ka, was believed to persist after death, or at least could be hallucinated by the living, thus maintaining a perceived connection and communication with the deceased ruler. And other Egyptian texts. He also points to texts like the famous dispute of a man with his Ba, another complex concept, sometimes translated soul or personality. The text presents a dialogue where a man is arguing with his Ba, which is urging him towards death. Jaynes interprets this very literally as a dialogue with an auditory hallucination, perhaps a depressive or negating voice, similar in structure to the kind of internal dialogues reported by some contemporary schizophrenic patients. Again, this literal interpretation is often resisted by mainstream Egyptologists who prefer more abstract psychological or metaphorical readings.
So, the textual evidence from multiple ancient cultures seems to point towards a lack of subjective language and a focus on external commands. But Jaynes didn't stop there. He also pointed to archaeological evidence, right? Physical remains.
Oh, absolutely. He argued that the physical structures and practices of these early civilizations also bear the imprint of the bicameral mind. One key piece of evidence he highlights is the ubiquitous presence of huge, centrally located, and from our modern secular perspective, seemingly otherwise useless monumental buildings in the hearts of early cities.
You mean things like ziggurats and pyramids?
Exactly. The ziggurats in Mesopotamia, the pyramids in Egypt, the massive temple complexes and pyramids found in Olmec and Maya sites in Mesoamerica, like La Venta or the appropriately named Teotihuacan, which means place of the gods.
So how do these massive labor-intensive structures support the bicameral theory? Why build them?
Jaynes argues these weren't primarily places of worship in our subjective sense. Places for quiet contemplation or personal communion with a distant deity. Instead, he proposed they were functional centers of divine authority, architectural constructs designed to amplify the sense of the god's immediate presence and potentially function as hallucinogenic aids for large populations.
Hallucinogenic aids? How?
By their sheer scale, their central visibility, their specific orientation often towards celestial events, their design, which often included a small room or shrine at the very top for the god's statue or symbol. He suggested these features served to focus attention, induce awe, and reinforce the reality and authority of the divine presence, making it easier for people to hear the guiding voices associated with that place or deity. Cities like Teotihuacan seem architecturally designed so that the massive god houses atop the pyramids of the sun and moon were constantly visible from almost anywhere in the city, visually orienting the entire social structure around these perceived centers of divine command.
And even earlier sites show something similar.
Yes, he points to much older Neolithic sites like Çatalhöyük in Turkey, around 7000 BC, where almost every single excavated house seems to have contained a dedicated shrine or god's room, suggesting a constant, intimate, household-level connection to this bicameral authority, embodied perhaps in statues or symbols that were believed to speak.
So the architecture wasn't just symbolic representation, it was functional infrastructure for a bicameral society.
That's the argument, yes. It was designed to enhance and manage the auditory and visual experience of the divine presence that guided the society. Another compelling, if perhaps grim, area of archaeological evidence Jaynes points to is the treatment of the dead in many ancient civilizations.
How so? What practices?
Practices like, in some very early sites like Aynen in the Levant, finding evidence that dead rulers might have been propped up after death, perhaps continuing to preside symbolically. Or the common practices of providing food and drink offerings to the dead, burying them with tools or servants for the afterlife, or even keeping skulls of ancestors within the home.
And these weren't just symbolic acts of remembrance for absent loved ones, in his view.
He argues they likely weren't just symbolic. They are interpreted as potentially literal, desperate attempts to maintain the connection with the hallucinated voices of the deceased. Because if the voices of the dead could still be heard, then the dead were, in a very real sense, perceived as still participating in their lives.
So the voices hadn't stopped just because the body died.
Exactly. Michael Carr's research on the she corpse personator ceremony in early China, where a living relative would literally embody the spirit of the deceased ancestor and speak with their voice during rituals, is a vivid example of this attempt to maintain auditory contact. Jaynes argues ancient civilizations simply did not understand death as the final absolute cessation of the person in the way conscious minds generally do, precisely because the guiding, commanding voices of important individuals could persist as hallucinations in the minds of the living.
Okay, that's fascinating. Texts and archaeology. Jaynes also tried to ground this in the neuroscience that was available back when he was writing in the 1970s.
Yes, he definitely drew upon the emerging understanding of brain function, particularly the studies on hemispheric specialization, which were really taking off around that time.
What specifically did he draw on?
Well, these early studies had already shown that while the left hemisphere is typically dominant for speech production in most right-handed people, both hemispheres, particularly areas in the right temporal lobe, possess significant capacity for language comprehension.
Ah, so the right side could understand language, even if it didn't usually speak. And this supported his model of the right hemisphere speaking the commands and the left hemisphere hearing them.
Precisely. It lent neurological plausibility to his core hypothesis of a vestigial functioning of the right Wernicke's area, a non-dominant language area in the right temporal lobe, acting as the neurological source of the God voices. These signals would then be processed as auditory input by the dominant language comprehension areas in the left temporal lobe.
And the split brain studies you mentioned earlier, how did they fit in?
Those studies on patients whose corpus callosum had been severed, usually to treat severe epilepsy, were really compelling for him, because they demonstrated that, under specific experimental conditions, the two hemispheres could process information and even initiate actions with a striking degree of independence, sometimes appearing to have separate spheres of awareness or intention. This provided a potential neural basis, an analogy, for a relationship similar to the man-god dynamic Jaynes saw in ancient texts, one side generating commands or possessing knowledge, the other side receiving and acting, perhaps with limited conscious access across the divide.
And the observed differences in the kind of cognitive functions the hemispheres seem specialized for.
Right. Even early on, research suggested the right hemisphere had strengths in spatial processing, recognizing patterns, understanding context, music, and holistic thinking. This seemed to align well, for Jaynes, with the kind of synthetic, authoritative, context-aware commands a guiding God voice might give. Meanwhile, the left hemisphere's established strengths in language production, logical sequencing, and analytical tasks fit the role of the man part, the receiver and executor of those commands in the world.
Okay. And finally, underpinning all this was the brain's known plasticity.
Yes, that was crucial. The understanding that the brain isn't rigidly hardwired, but is significantly plastic, its connections and functions can be profoundly organized and shaped by environmental input, by learning, by culture throughout life. This supported the core Jaynesian idea that a fundamental mental restructuring, like the proposed shift from a bicameral organization to a conscious one, could indeed be a learned cultural phenomenon. It didn't have to depend solely on slow genetic evolution changing the brain's basic hardware over millennia. The way the hardware was used, the software, could change much more rapidly through cultural learning.
Okay, so we have the theory, the definitions, the challenges to other fields, and the lines of evidence Jaynes presented from texts, archaeology, and neuroscience. Let's try and make this even more tangible. What did it actually feel like to live day to day in a bicameral world? Can we even imagine it? How did they experience daily life without that constant inner chatter, that subjective world, but instead hearing voices of command?
It's incredibly hard for us to imagine, but we have to try. Jaynes paints a picture of a world profoundly different from ours. Imagine your actions, your tasks, your decisions, especially non-routine ones, not being driven by your own internal planning or deliberation, but by a voice you perceive as completely external, utterly real, belonging to a god or ancestor or king, telling you what to do, where to go, how to perform a specific task.
So life was guided by constant auditory commands.
Or anything beyond habit, yes. It was a world fundamentally structured by obedience.
Obedience, not just in the social sense to a visible king or law, but obedience to a voice seemingly inside your own head, yet perceived as external.
Exactly. And Jaynes stresses this wasn't metaphorical belief or faith or spiritual alignment as we might understand those terms today in a conscious framework. It meant literally hearing a voice, feeling its undeniable authority, and simply acting upon it. The voice might direct a hunter where to find game that day, instruct a builder on a specific technique for laying bricks, tell someone exactly what words to say in a ritual, a social encounter, or command a soldier whom to follow or attack in battle.
And there was no internal conflict, no questioning of the command.
Jaynes argues no, because there was no subjective I separate from the voice to do the questioning. There was no internal mind space within which to weigh alternatives or debate the command's wisdom or morality. The heard voice was the volition. To hear was to obey.
That's almost mind-bending to contemplate from our conscious perspective. It forces us to rethink fundamental human acts, fundamental stories.
It completely does. Think about that pivotal story in the Old Testament. Abraham commanded by the voice of God to sacrifice his own son, Isaac. As Jaynes points out, the text describes Abraham proceeding with the preparations seemingly without protest. He doesn't appear to wrestle internally with a horrific moral dilemma, debating the command, raging against God in his mind. He simply obeys.
Right.
Now, later theologians, living in a conscious age, centuries later, would interpret this as an ultimate act of faith, a conscious choice Abraham made, suppressing his natural love for his son to obey God's will. But Jaynes offers a radically different interpretation. If Abraham was a bicameral man living in a world guided by auditory imperative...
He didn't have a choice in our sense.
Exactly. He heard an irresistible hallucinated imperative from his deity, and he simply executed it automatically, without the internal conflict that a conscious mind would inevitably experience. Understanding this possibility radically alters the interpretation of that foundational story about faith and obedience.
Okay, so if their actions were guided by voices, how did interpersonal communication work in this world? If they weren't really talking from a subjective self to another subjective self, what did they actually say to each other?
That's a great question. Jaynes suggests communication would likely have been much more functional, more directive, more focused on external actions, coordinating tasks, relaying commands received from authorities, human or divine. It would probably lack the complex layers of subjective interpretation, hidden meanings, subtle emotional nuance, strategic ambiguity, and complex attempts to manipulate others' internal mental states that are so common in our conscious discourse.
Because we use language not just to convey facts, but to manage our own and others' subjective experiences, feelings, beliefs, intentions.
Precisely. We're constantly trying to model what the other person is thinking or feeling. Without that subjective experience on both ends, that kind of layered interpretive communication is greatly diminished or simply absent. Communication would be more about transmitting instructions and information relevant to immediate action.
And this lack of subjective interiority and modeling of other minds suggests that complex deception, lying, would be difficult for them.
Extremely difficult, Jaynes argues. Sustained, strategic lying, elaborate plots involving hidden motives, or sophisticated treachery. These likely required the emergence of the analog I and the ability to construct an internal narrative of the lie, to simulate the situation within mind space, and crucially, to predict and manipulate the subjective responses of others within that mental simulation.
You need an inner world to build a false outer world.
Exactly. Without that internal simulation capacity, coordinating complex deception is likely impossible for a purely bicameral individual. They might be able to engage in simple forms of concealment, perhaps, but not the intricate, multi-layered deception a conscious mind can contrive.
Jaynes and others discussing him sometimes use the encounter between the Spanish conquistadors and the Incas in the 16th century as a powerful, though obviously tragic, illustration of this potential difference between a conscious and a largely bicameral, or perhaps proto-subjective, mentality.
Yes, it serves as a vivid, albeit devastating historical example. The Incas, whose empire was relatively young and whose mentality, Jaynes would argue, was likely still heavily reliant on external authorization, perceived commands from the Sapa Inca, seen as divine, the sun god Inti, or various oracles and idols were suddenly confronted by the Spanish. And as Adam Mars-Jones discusses in relation to Jaynes' ideas, these were unprecedented men, utterly unlike anyone the Incas had encountered before, operating with a different mental framework.
And the Incas' response to this unprecedented invasion was different from what we might expect from a fully conscious society facing a similar threat.
Profoundly different in Jaynes' interpretation. Lacking the fully developed internal analog I and the capacity for the kind of flexible internal deliberation, long-term strategic simulation, and Machiavellian calculation that conquistadors possess, they didn't seem to have the necessary mental tools for the kind of sustained, deceptive diplomacy, treachery, and rapid strategic adaptation the Spanish employed.
They couldn't narratize out the deception of others, as Jaynes put it.
Right. They seemed unable to fully comprehend or anticipate the Spaniards' capacity for duplicity and breaking sacred oaths, because those concepts rely on understanding subjective intention and the possibility of hiding it.
So when faced with this completely novel, terrifying situation like Pizarro capturing their divine emperor Atahualpa through blatant trickery, they didn't react with immediate, unified strategic counterplanning in the way a modern conscious army might.
Not effectively, no. Their response, in many crucial moments, appears to have been characterized by confusion, indecision, adherence to established rituals that were suddenly irrelevant, or a kind of stunned paralysis stemming from the capture of their central authority figure and the silence of their gods in the face of this catastrophe. This allowed Pizarro's incredibly small band of conquistadors to overcome a vastly larger and well-organized Inca force. Jaynes argues it was largely because the Incas, lacking fully developed conscious volition, the capacity for strategic deception, and the ability for independent initiative when their established command structure was disrupted by overwhelming novelty, simply did not know how to act effectively in a world no longer governed by clear commands or predictable rules.
It's a stark illustration of how different mental operating systems might react to crisis. And this also brings up the difficult question of morality. You mentioned bicameral individuals wouldn't likely plot complex crimes in our sense.
Correct. Lacking the internal narrative space and the analog I needed for premeditation and simulation of consequences, they probably wouldn't engage in deliberate, self-motivated cruelty, intricate fraud, or complex plotting in the way conscious individuals unfortunately can. However, and this is crucial, if commanded by an authoritative voice, a god, a king perceived as divine, they are potentially capable of carrying out acts that we would consider horrific, such as mass slaughter in battle or large-scale ritual human sacrifice, as practiced by cultures like the Aztecs or, to some extent, the Incas.
But they wouldn't experience it as an immoral choice.
Jaynes argues they wouldn't experience conscious feelings of guilt, grief, or grapple with a moral dilemma in our subjective sense. Their actions were dictated, externally authorized, not chosen based on an internal moral framework or empathy derived from simulating the victim's subjective experience. Morality for them was obedience to the voices.
Whereas the conquistadors, operating as subjective men,
were fully capable of constructing internal narratives and long-term goals. They could narratize their Spanish futures, imagining conquest, wealth, glory, and salvation, reflecting the immense power of conscious planning and goal-directed behavior driven by an internal narrative. But, tragically, this same subjective capacity also enabled the capacity for deliberate cruelty, calculated treachery, and systemic exploitation on a scale perhaps unimaginable to a purely bicameral mind. It's a double-edged sword. Brian McVeigh makes an interesting point here, suggesting that figures like Jesus, emerging after the proposed breakdown, represent a move away from the potentially heartless, legalistic obedience of bicameralism toward the new ethic of compassionate concern for the subjective experience of the other, which is a key development in conscious morality.
Okay, so this bicameral state, this world guided by voices, wasn't destined to last forever. Jaynes called it a fragile solution to the challenges of organizing early complex societies, lasting maybe 7,000 years or so after the rise of agriculture. And eventually, he argues, it broke down. What caused this monumental shift in human mentality? What led to the birth of consciousness?
Jaynes points to a confluence of factors, primarily increasing societal complexity and widespread social disruption that occurred particularly intensely in the second millennium BC. Mass migrations, invasions, natural disasters, the collapse of established empires, these played a major role.
Like the Bronze Age collapse.
It's exactly. Events like the massive eruption of the volcano Thera, modern Santorini, around 1600 or perhaps later, maybe closer to 1230 BC, according to some dating, caused widespread devastation, tsunamis, and climate shifts across the Mediterranean and Near East. This is thought to have severely impacted powerful, established bicameral empires like the Minoans, the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans. The chaos and mixing of peoples during this period of collapse would have severely disrupted the stable, hierarchical social structures and isolated cultural contexts that Jaynes believed were necessary to maintain the bicameral system. The Exodus story, potentially occurring around this time, might also reflect these massive social upheavals.
And just the sheer scale of societies was becoming a problem. Overpopulation in agricultural centers.
Yes. As populations grew larger, denser, and more interconnected in agricultural societies, maintaining social control solely through individualized, auditory commands from specific authority figures, kings, priests, idols, became increasingly difficult and inefficient. A system based on hearing and obeying voices from specific known authorities worked reasonably well in smaller, more stable tribal groups or early city-states, but it scaled poorly to large, complex, multi-ethnic empires facing constant stress and change. The signals got crossed, the authorities multiplied, conflicts arose.
And a crucial factor in this breakdown, perhaps counterintuitively, was the development and spread of writing.
Absolutely. Jaynes argues the success of writing was a major catalyst in undermining the bicameral mind. Once laws, decrees, religious texts, and even personal messages could be written down, they became permanent, portable, and accessible to many, independent of the original speaker or authority figure.
How did that break the system?
Written texts offered an objective, external source of authority and information that could be consulted, referenced, compared, debated, and interpreted collectively. This began to displace the transient, individually apprehended, unverifiable auditory voices as the primary source of guidance and social order. Writing allowed humans to, in a profound sense, escape the tyranny of their auditory hallucinations by providing an alternative, stable, publicly verifiable source of knowledge and rules, rather than relying solely on a fleeting internal, but perceived as external, auditory command. You could point to the written law, you couldn't point to the voice only you heard.
So as these pressures mounted chaos, complexity, the rise of writing, the old bicameral system, started to fray. Humans began to lose their gods.
Yes. The hallucinated voices, Jaynes argues, became less frequent, less clear, less reliable, or perhaps ceased entirely for many individuals as the social and neurological conditions supporting them eroded.
And we see evidence of this loss in texts from that period.
We do. Ancient texts emerging from this very period of breakdown, roughly the late 2nd and early 1st millennia BC, expressed this sense of profound loss and abandonment. That Mesopotamian poem we mentioned earlier, Little Bell Nemeki, I will praise the Lord of wisdom, often called the Babylonian Job, is a poignant example. The speaker laments, "My God has forsaken me and disappeared. The good angel who walked beside me has departed." Jaynes argues these aren't just poetic metaphors for feeling distant from God in a modern sense. They are more likely literal descriptions of the experience of losing the guiding auditory hallucinations that had previously structured one's life.
That loss of the guiding voices, the certainty they provided, must have caused immense anxiety and a deep sense of uncertainty.
A fundamental existential crisis. The bicameral world, for all its limitations from our perspective, provided certainty. Your actions were dictated by divine command, you knew what to do. The emerging conscious world, lacking these clear external directives, left individuals faced with a terrifying void, the burden of having to decide for themselves, to navigate ambiguity, to find meaning, without the clear imperative from a perceived God.
And is this when concepts like heavens and underworlds arise as places the silent gods retreated to?
Jaynes suggests exactly that. As the voices fell silent on earth, elaborate mythologies developed about where the gods had gone to celestial heavens or distant underworlds to explain their absence while still maintaining belief in their existence. And this period ushered in what Jaynes calls a servant search for archaic authorization.
Archaic authorization,
Meaning desperate attempts by newly conscious or partially conscious individuals and societies to reconnect with, simulate, or find substitutes for the lost divine guidance. They needed new ways to find certainty and direction in a silent world. The proliferation of divination, the rise of prophecy, the intense focus on interpreting signs and omens, the development of complex prayer and sacrifice rituals aimed at eliciting a divine response, all these can be seen in this light. Even the Psalms in the Old Testament, filled with anguished cries of abandonment and pleading questions, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are the gods no longer heard? Jaynes interprets as expressions of this post-bicameral crisis a conscious mind grappling with the terrifying silence left by the absent voices.
Okay, so the shift from bicameralism to consciousness was massive, driven by historical forces, and resulted in a profound sense of loss and a search for new forms of authority. But Jaynes argues it wasn't an absolute clean break. The old system didn't just vanish overnight. Are there remnants, echoes, or what he calls vestiges of that earlier bicameral mentality still with us today, or observable in history after the main breakdown?
Yes, absolutely. He argues that the transition was messy and incomplete, leaving behind various vestiges, functional analogs of bicameral processes that continue to persist, often in altered forms within conscious individuals and societies. Identifying these vestiges is a major part of his argument for the reality of the bicameral mind.
Okay, what's a key example of a vestige that emerged prominently after the breakdown?
One of the most significant is the massive proliferation of omens and divination practices. These seem to explode precisely during the period when the direct divine commands were fading.
It makes intuitive sense, doesn't it? If the voices aren't telling you directly what to do anymore, you start looking desperately for signs in the world around you, the flight of birds, the patterns in sheep livers, random events.
Exactly. Jaynes points out that, significantly, there are virtually no Sumerian omen texts from the earliest periods of Mesopotamian civilization, presumably because they had the direct voices and didn't need them. But omen texts absolutely proliferate in the first millennium BCE, exactly when the breakdown was widespread and consciousness was emerging. Remember Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh? A huge chunk of it, maybe 30%, consisted of these detailed omen texts.
And these are typically those, if this happens, then that means this kinds of texts, right? Like recipes for finding guidance.
Yes, omen texts are classically structured as protasis, the if clause, describing the observed event, if a snake falls from the roof onto a man. And epidosis, the then clause, giving the interpretation or the resulting command that man will die or the king should not go forth from the palace. Jaynes sees these practices as attempts by conscious or semi-conscious minds to use external phenomena, often involving pattern recognition, like interpreting animal behavior or selectual patterns, a function primarily associated with the right hemisphere to generate decisions or predictions that were previously handled directly by the internal bicameral voices.
So they were trying to kind of externally trigger or leverage that right hemisphere pattern recognition ability to replace the commands they weren't hearing anymore.
That's the essence of his interpretation. And related practices like sortilege casting lots, flipping coins, using dice, he interprets as culturally invented techniques to supplement right hemisphere function for ordering parts, making choices, or resolving ambiguity when the authoritative voice was gone. While some modern thinkers like Daniel Dennett view divination more simply as a cognitive strategy to cope with uncertainty or pass the buck for difficult decisions, Jaynes and the Julian Jaynes Society researchers emphasize the crucial cultural and historical context. It's passing the buck specifically to a replacement authority source, often one that taps into non-conscious pattern-matching processes that might echo the old bicameral system's way of generating answers.
Okay, omens and divination make sense as a replacement strategy. What about other vestiges? You mentioned figures like angels or genii. How do they fit in?
Jaynes points to an intriguing evolution in how these guiding or guardian figures are depicted in art, particularly in the ancient Near East. In earlier periods, gods or divine messengers are often shown actively speaking to humans who are listening intently. But later, especially in the first millennium BCE after the proposed breakdown, you start seeing the proliferation of figures like the winged Assyrian genii or guardian angels. These figures often accompany the king or important individuals, but they are depicted as silent.
They're just there, not interact.
Often, yes. They stand beside the human figure, perhaps holding symbolic items, but they no longer appear to be speaking, and the human is no longer depicted in a posture of actively listening as they often were in earlier art. Jaynes interprets this shift as the auditory actuality of the bicameral relationship becoming a supposed and assumed silent relationship. The voice is gone, but the memory or the concept of the guiding presence remains, transformed into a silent visual symbol. This, he suggests, is part of the process by which the lived reality of bicameralism evolved into what we now call mythology. The once-heard reality became a visual, silent, symbolic representation, still carrying authority, but no longer an active conversational partner.
That's subtle but interesting. What about phenomena like oracles and states of spirit possession? Those seem like a much more direct echo of hearing voices or being controlled by an external entity.
They are perhaps the most overt and dramatic remnants of the bicameral system, Jaynes argues. He views these states, trance, possession, prophetic utterance, as periods where the right hemisphere, the former source of the bicameral voices, temporarily dominates speech output, often resulting in oracular pronouncements or speaking in tongues. Crucially, the person experiencing this state, the oracle or the possessed individual, often reports having no memory of what they said afterward.
Amnesia for the event.
Yes, indicating a profound gap from their normal conscious awareness and control. This dissociation fits the model of a different neural system taking over verbalization.
And the Oracle of Delphi is the classic, most famous example.
Exactly. The Pythia at Delphi is a prime example. Her pronouncements, often ambiguous and delivered in a trance state, held immense authority in the ancient Greek world for centuries. The oracle endured for an incredibly long time, well into the conscious era, and remarkably, had significant historical influence, advising cities, kings, and even siding with foreign invaders like Xerxes against the Greeks, demonstrating the perceived power and historical strength these phenomena retained even after the general breakdown of bicameralism.
And ancient writers described these states as happening without conscious awareness.
Yes. Plato and others explicitly describe prophetic states like those of the Pythia as occurring without consciousness or out of one's mind. Jaynes also notes that the training procedures described for oracles often involve specific induction techniques like fasting, isolation, inhaling fumes, possibly hallucinogenic, focusing on repetitive stimuli seemingly designed to narrow conscious awareness, suppress the left hemisphere's dominance, and induce a trance state conducive to right hemisphere-generated utterances.
And the historical trajectory of oracles also seems to fit the theory.
It does. Over time, the nature of oracular pronouncements seems to change. Early accounts sometimes suggest clearer, more direct God voices. Later, they often become more garbled, obscure, requiring interpretation by attendant priests. Eventually, the oracles became increasingly erratic, less reliable, and ultimately faded away or were suppressed. This historical decline mirrors the proposed fading of the clear bicameral imperative and the increasing dominance of conscious thought. Jaynes also speculated about possible neurological links, like potential activation of right hemisphere speech areas during possession, leading to the contorted facial features often described, due to right hemisphere motor control, and noted the higher incidence of female oracles, sibyls, Pythias, potentially linked to findings suggesting slightly less rigid lateralization of language functions in women in our culture, although that's a complex and debated area of neuroscience.
And in a more modern and perhaps surprising connection, Jaynes considered Gilles de la Tourette's syndrome as a possible vestige.
Yes, somewhat provocatively. He suggested that Tourette's syndrome, characterized by involuntary vocalizations, idics, sometimes including profanity or socially inappropriate remarks, the foul-mouthed disease aspect, and motor tics, could potentially be seen as a kind of neurological vestige of these involuntary, sometimes negatory possession states. It represents an uncontrolled verbal or motor output, potentially linked to disinhibition or unusual activity in brain circuits involving the basal ganglia and frontal cortex, which might echo, in a distorted way, the involuntary nature of the voices or actions experienced in the bicameral state or trance phenomena. It's an involuntary utterance breaking through conscious control.
Okay. Now, one of the most evocative and perhaps poetic vestiges Jaynes discusses involves the origins of poetry and music.
Yes, he offers a truly remarkable thesis. The first poets were gods. Poetry began with the bicameral mind. He suggests that the God side of the bicameral mind, the right hemisphere source of the voices, often spoke not in prose but in verse, in meter, in rhythm.
So ancient epic poems, like Homer's or the Epic of Gilgamesh, weren't just written down poetically, they were actually heard that way by the people receiving the dictation.
That's the core idea. Jaynes points to accounts from multiple ancient cultures, Greece, Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, with the Vedas, that describe their foundational epic poems or sacred texts as having been heard or received as poetry, dictated directly by gods or muses to prophets, rishi in India, bards, eodoi in Greece, or scribes. He notes that oracles, like the Pythia Delphi, often deliver their pronouncements in dactylic hexameter, a specific and complex poetic meter. And the Hebrew prophets in the Old Testament, when relaying the words of Yahweh, frequently spoke in powerful parallel verse.
So the divine voice was inherently poetic. And the muses in ancient Greece, they weren't just abstract symbols of inspiration for conscious poets.
No, Jaynes argues they were likely experienced, at least initially, as actual hallucinatory sources of memory and poetic utterance. He suggests this was particularly important for late bicameral or transitional individuals who lacked a fully developed conscious sense of past, who did not have lifetimes in our narrative sense, and therefore couldn't reminisce or consciously structure narratives about the past. The muses, daughters of memory, Mnemosyne, provided the story, the history, the epic through hallucinated voice. Hesiod's vivid description of encountering the muses on Mount Helicon in his Theogony depicts them not as abstract concepts, but as tangible entities seen and heard in hallucination, who breathe the poem into him.
And he connects this to the social status of early poets.
Yes, he notes that figures like Hesiod were often from more rural, perhaps isolated or less socially integrated backgrounds, shepherds, like Hesiod describes himself, mere bellies, the muses call shepherds. He suggests these individuals might have been less fully integrated into the emerging conscious mentality of the cities, and that factors like social isolation or loneliness, which are known to sometimes induce hallucinatory experiences, might have helped them retain a stronger connection to these bicameral voice phenomena.
And what about music? How does that fit in as a vestige?
Jaynes speculates, quite intriguingly, that the invention and use of music, particularly rhythmic or incantatory music, may have functioned originally as a neural excitant for hallucinations. In a world where the natural bicameral voices were starting to fade, perhaps rhythmic sound, chanting, or instrumental music served as a technique to help induce the necessary trance state or auditory hallucination needed for guidance or decision-making.
A neurological trigger for the voices.
Potentially. He suggests a possible neurological link through the spread of neural excitation from right hemisphere areas known to be involved in processing music, especially melody and harmony, to adjacent temporal lobe areas, potentially involved in generating the divine auditory hallucinations. Music might have become a tool to access the fading God voice.
Hypnosis is another modern phenomenon Jaynes interprets through this bicameral lens.
Yes, he sees hypnosis not as some mystical power, but as a clear vestige that strongly engages what he calls the general bicameral paradigm. He identifies 4 key aspects present in hypnosis that echo the old system.
What are those 4 aspects?
First, a collective cognitive imperative, a shared belief system within a culture or group that validates and defines the phenomenon. Hypnosis is real. People can be hypnotized. Second, an induction procedure, a ritualized process, counting down, focusing attention, specifically designed to narrow consciousness and bypass normal volitional control. Third, the resulting trance state, characterized by heightened suggestibility and dissociation. And fourth, archaic authorization. The hypnotist temporarily takes on the role of the external, authoritative voice, guiding behavior that would normally be under conscious control.
And the effectiveness of hypnosis, or even the type of things people do under hypnosis, depends heavily on that first part, the shared belief system.
Exactly. Jaynes points out that the specific phenomena achievable under hypnosis have changed dramatically throughout history, often mirroring the prevailing cultural beliefs about what hypnosis can do. This strongly demonstrates its dependence on this collective cognitive imperative, this shared expectation. The hypnotist essentially gets permission, through the ritual and belief system, to temporarily take over the role of the bicameral voice, issuing commands that bypass conscious deliberation and directly guide behavior, sometimes actions that would be difficult or impossible to perform voluntarily with full conscious awareness.
And there's evidence linking hypnotic susceptibility to certain traits?
Yes, research, both from Jaynes's time and more recently, has often found correlations between high hypnotic susceptibility and traits sometimes associated with right hemisphere processing or less rigid left hemisphere dominance, such as creativity, absorption, tendency towards fantasy, and even religiosity. Also, interestingly, a history of having vivid imaginary companions in childhood.
Imaginary companions, how do they connect?
Especially imaginary companions that were perceived as being conscience-related, a voice or a figure that criticized, guided, or offered moral advice. This mirrors the authoritative guiding nature of the original bicameral voices. Jaynes highlights how difficult it is for most people to perform complex hypnotic feats under normal conscious conditions, like genuinely acting colorblind if you're not, or behaving convincingly like an animal when alone in a room.
Why is it so hard consciously?
He argues that normal waking consciousness acts as a wilderness of distracting closenesses, a constant stream of internal chatter, self-awareness, social inhibitions, and competing thoughts that prevents the direct access to behavioral execution that seems possible in the bicameral state or under hypnosis. You need, as he puts it, the permission of a group, the social authorization provided through the hypnotic induction ritual and the shared belief, to bypass this conscious barrier and achieve these extraordinary feats of behavioral control outside of the normal trance state.
Okay, perhaps the most poignant and maybe most controversial vestige Jaynes discusses is contemporary schizophrenia.
Yes, he views schizophrenia not as a completely alien disease state, but as a kind of partial relapse into the bicameral mind, occurring, tragically, in individuals who were born and raised within a conscious society and possess the structures of conscious thought, however fragmented.
And the symptoms of schizophrenia seem to mirror specific features of the proposed bicameral mind.
Strikingly so in many cases. Key symptoms include auditory hallucinations, often experienced as external voices that are critical, commanding, or religious in nature, very much like the God voices. A breakdown of ego boundaries, a loss of the stable analog I and the coherent mind space. Difficulty with narratization, leading to disorganized thought and speech. Feelings of being controlled by external forces, like an automaton, my hand proffers itself, one patient described. A disturbed sense of time, sometimes a feeling of timelessness, reflecting the loss of consciously spatialized time. experiencing thoughts or emotions as alien intrusions inserted from outside, and overwhelming feelings of panic or dread, but sometimes described in a strangely detached way, as if happening to them without a stable subjective us due to experience it as belonging to them.
But it's crucially different from the original bicameralism of ancient peoples. It's not a simple return.
Critically different, yes. Because the relapse is only partial, and it's happening within a mind that has already learned the structures of consciousness language, abstract concepts, social norms, the expectation of having a self. These learned structures remain, at least partially, creating immense dissonance, confusion, internal conflict, and suffering. This leads to the terror and the fury, the agony and despair that characterize the schizophrenic experience, which Jaynes believed was largely absent in the original integrated bicameral state.
And the lack of cultural support makes it worse.
Absolutely. Unlike the highly social bicameral individual whose voices were culturally validated, shared, and interpreted as divine guidance within a supportive social structure, the modern schizophrenic typically lacks any cultural context or support system that makes sense of their voices. The voices are dissonant, frightening, stigmatized, leading to disorganization, fear, and often profound social withdrawal. Also, the constant conscious search for the self, which is a feature of normal conscious anxiety, seems absent or shattered in schizophrenia, replaced by a chaotic, ungrounded state where the very idea of a stable, authoring self has dissolved.
Neurologically, Jaynes speculated back then about potential factors like overactive dopamine systems or abnormal stress responses.
Yes, he did. He also considered possibilities like a lack of enzymes needed to break down stress byproducts, or, very significantly, a potential impaired inhibition of right temporal cortex activity by the left hemisphere. This lack of inhibition would prevent the conscious left hemisphere from suppressing the auditory hallucinations originating in the right hemisphere language areas. And as we'll see, contemporary neuroscience has actually provided significant support for this specific idea of right-left temporal lobe dysregulation in schizophrenia.
Interesting. You mentioned imaginary companions in childhood earlier in relation to hypnosis. Jaynes saw them as a vestige in their own right.
Yes, he did. He noted that these are very common in young children and often involve what seem to be actual auditory or visual hallucinations, not just pretend play. He viewed them as another remnant of our bicameral heritage, perhaps a default state of having a guiding hallucinatory voice that is normally socially suppressed or integrated as children acquire language and the structures of consciousness within a conscious culture. However, this connection might be retained by some individuals.
And their correlation with hypnotic susceptibility, especially for those conscience-like companions, links them back to the authoritative bicameral voices.
Exactly. It suggests a connection to that pattern of externalized authority. In ancient civilizations, Jaynes argues, this guiding hallucinatory voice in childhood wouldn't have been suppressed. It would have been encouraged and culturally interpreted as the voice of one's personal god or an ancestor, laying the foundation for adult bicameral functioning.
And finally, in a perhaps more speculative vein, Jaynes even connected certain aspects of modern totalitarian states to the structure of bicameralism.
Yes, he discussed them briefly as a modern social phenomena that seems to mirror certain structural aspects of bicameral psychology, specifically the explicit denial of the individual self, the suppression of individual volition and internal dissent in favor of absolute obedience to the party, the state, or a deified leader.
How does that mirror bicameralism?
It relies on attributing all decisions, all volition, all correct thought to an external, infallible agent, the party, the leader's thought, which might be deemed infallible as seen in some regimes. This structure echoes the bicameral reliance on an external, infallible source of command, the God voice, rather than individual self-authorization and internal deliberation. However, Jaynes also raised the crucial question of whether a full return to a truly integrated functional bicameral state is actually possible once subjective consciousness, with its analog I and mind space, has fully emerged in a culture. As he famously put it, it might be impossible to get the cat of self-consciousness back into the bag once it's out. You can create societies based on obedience, but maybe not true bicameral minds anymore.
Okay, so we have the theory, the evidence Jaynes presented, and this fascinating array of potential vestiges. It's clearly a provocative, wide-ranging, and, let's be honest, controversial theory. But you mentioned the Julian Jaynes Society has been actively promoting research to test, refine, and extend these ideas since the book was published. What does contemporary science, especially neuroscience after 1976, have to say about Jaynes's claims? Has his theory gained scientific credibility?
This is where things get really interesting, because the answer, for many, is increasingly yes. Post-1976 research, particularly in neuroscience, using modern brain imaging techniques that Jaynes could only dream of, has provided some quite compelling support, especially for his neurological model of auditory hallucinations.
Okay, can you give some specific examples of that?
One of the most frequently cited studies is by a researcher named Belinda Lennox and her colleagues, published in 1999, that used fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, to scan the brains of schizophrenic patients while they were actively experiencing auditory hallucinations.
And what did they find?
They found patterns of brain activity that matched Jaynes' prediction remarkably well. Specifically, they observed increased activity in areas of the right temporal lobe, particularly regions involved in language processing, like the right superior temporal gyrus near Wernicke's homologue, often preceding or coinciding with activity in the dominant left hemisphere language areas, like Broca's and Wernicke's areas, and the auditory cortex, where the voice is presumably perceived.
Wow. So the brain activity during the experience of hearing voices seems to follow that right-to-left temporal lobe pathway that Jaynes hypothesized decades earlier was the mechanism for the bicameral voices.
Exactly. It showed a right-left temporal lobe interaction that strongly resonated with his model. And subsequent research by other neuroscientists like Iris Sommer, Renee Kahn, Renard Jarre, and many others, using fMRI, PT scans, and other techniques, has continued to find evidence supporting this specific neurological model for auditory verbal hallucinations in schizophrenia and other conditions. These studies often explicitly reference or quote Jaynes' original hypothesis as being predictive.
So that specific neurological prediction seems to be holding up.
It appears to be a robust finding, yes. While auditory hallucinations are complex and can involve other brain networks too, this specific right-left temporal pathway, which Jaynes pinpointed as potentially crucial for the authoritative God voice of bicameralism, appears to be consistently implicated in the experience of hearing voices. Furthermore, some research continues to explore related ideas, like the possibility that the brain hemispheres might have operated with less functional integration prior to the development of consciousness, becoming more dynamically integrated as subjective experience and the need for internal coherence developed.
That's pretty powerful validation on the neuroscience front. What about linguistics? Has further research supported Jaynes' claims about the evolution of a psycholexicon?
Yes, that line of inquiry has also been actively pursued. Researchers associated with the JJS continue to conduct detailed analyses of ancient texts to document the historical emergence of mental language, the vocabulary available within a culture to describe internal states like thinking, believing, intending, feeling, subjectively.
Like Boban Dedovich's work you mentioned.
Exactly. Boban Dedovic has done incredibly detailed linguistic work on ancient Egyptian texts, such as the famous story of Genii, and has also performed rigorous quantitative linguistic analyses comparing the vocabulary used in the Iliad versus the Odyssey. His findings strongly support Jaynes' original observations, tracing a clear development over time in the frequency and type of language used to refer to internal states and subjective experience.
And this isn't just a Greek or Egyptian phenomenon.
No. Other researchers have found similar patterns elsewhere, suggesting it might be a more global phenomenon linked to the rise of consciousness, just happening at different times. Michael Carr documented comparable linguistic transitions in ancient Chinese texts, showing the gradual appearance of words for internal thought and feeling. Todd Gibson has done similar work tracing the emergence of subjective language in ancient Tibetan literature. This cross-cultural evidence strengthens the argument that the pattern Jaynes identified isn't just an artifact of Greek or Near Eastern history, but reflects a broader shift in human mentality.
And this body of research directly addresses that common criticism that just because the specific word consciousness didn't exist doesn't mean the experience or concept was absent.
Yes, precisely. These linguistic studies counter that criticism by demonstrating the absence not just of a single word, but of a whole system of vocabulary, a rich psycholexicon for describing a wide range of internal mental activities, subjective feelings, self-reflection, and internal deliberation in the older texts, compared to its gradual emergence in later ones. Rabbi James Cone's linguistic comparisons, showing the stark difference in subjective language between older Old Testament books like Amos and Isaiah, and much later, more introspective books like Ecclesiastes and Daniel, further illustrate this specific progression of language referring to internal states, providing strong support for the philological aspect of Jaynes' theory.
Okay, neuroscience and linguistics offer support. Does anthropology provide any contemporary insights or echoes?
It does. One interesting line of research comes from Franco Rodriguez, who has studied contemporary Mayan oral storytelling traditions around Lake Atitlan in Guatemala. His fieldwork finds intriguing traces in their narratives of what could be interpreted as remnants or echoes of a bicameral or transitional mentality.
What kind of traces?
Things like stories involving encounters with spirits or supernatural beings who speak directly to people, accounts of fading voices or lost abilities to communicate with the divine, a continued reliance on divination practices for guidance, and narratives describing states of possession or trance.
And crucially, these aren't necessarily framed within their culture as signs of pathology or mental illness.
That's the key point. Rodriguez suggests that these phenomena are often presented within the Mayan cultural context, not primarily as symptoms of illness, but perhaps as lingering abilities, spiritual experiences, or known ways of interacting with the world that the Maya, perhaps due to their specific cultural history and relative isolation, haven't felt the same pressure to suppress, rationalize away, or pathologize as much as has happened in dominant Western cultures.
So it offers a living, cross-cultural perspective.
Yes, it offers a glimpse into a cultural context where vestiges, similar to those Jaynes identified in ancient history, might still persist more overtly. It suggests the transition to modern consciousness isn't necessarily a monolithic, uniform global event that happened everywhere in the same way at the same time, but can manifest differently and leave different kinds of traces depending on specific cultural factors and historical trajectories.
It seems clear that Jaynes's theory, while initially perhaps sounding outlandish, has spurred ongoing research and found some significant points of validation, especially in neuroscience and linguistics. Beyond the scientific details, though, the theory inevitably pushes us towards some really profound philosophical and even existential questions, doesn't it? It touches on some of the oldest questions humans have asked about who we are.
Oh, absolutely. It offers a unique and deeply challenging perspective on perennial philosophical puzzles like the body-mind problem or the mind-matter problem. Well, instead of seeing consciousness as some mysterious non-physical substance or property, somehow added from outside to a purely physical brain, a view that troubled thinkers like Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of evolution by natural selection, who couldn't see how consciousness could evolve naturally and thus posited a separate spiritual input. Jaynes reframes it entirely.
As an emergent property.
Yes, as an emergent cultural and linguistic phenomenon, a new way of operating, built upon existing biological structures, language capacity, brain plasticity, and their ability to be organized in complex ways through learning and cultural transmission. Consciousness isn't something extra injected into the physical system, it's a novel configuration of the system, learned like software.
Which definitely challenges any lingering ideas of humanity as a uniquely purposed creation with consciousness as its divine spark or the inevitable endpoint of evolution.
It does. It strongly reinforces the Darwinian perspective of evolution proceeding by natural processes and chance, but it extends it in a radical way. It suggests that even consciousness itself, which many people instinctively see as the pinnacle of biological development or even evidence of purpose, might not be an inherent, inevitable goal of biological evolution at all. Rather, it might be a remarkable but ultimately contingent, learned ability, a powerful adaptation, perhaps built upon that biological foundation through cultural history. Not all intelligent life would necessarily develop it.
And it radically changes our understanding of the origins and nature of religion, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It views the earliest forms of religion, the world of omnipresent gods, idols, divination, sacrifice in ancient civilizations, not solely as philosophical responses to human needs, like explaining the world, coping with death, and enforcing morality, nor as purely sociological mechanisms for social control, as some theories suggest. Instead, it sees these early religious structures and practices as direct manifestations of a specific neurocultural state, the bicameral mind, where perceived divine voices were a literal driving reality, shaping behavior and structuring society from the inside out. It critiques interpretations, like perhaps Dennett's view of religion largely as a philosophy of need, by highlighting the specific, unique cultural and neurological underpinnings of religion in the bicameral era, which were fundamentally different from the subjective beliefs and symbolic practices of later conscious religions.
And it even raises profound questions about the nature of reality itself and how we perceive it.
Yes. Jaynes suggests, and interpreters like Rabbi James Cone emphasize this aspect that consciousness operates through metaphor. Our understanding is built with language. A famous quote attributed to Jaynes is something like, "Words have meaning, not life or persons or the universe itself." This implies that our conscious understanding of reality isn't a direct, unmediated apprehension of some external objective truth. Instead, our experience of reality is deeply shaped, structured, and perhaps even limited by the specific metaphorical, linguistic framework our culture provides and the conscious mind space that framework constructs. We see the world through our metaphors.
That's a very constructivist view. And the whole narrative about the breakdown of bicameralism, the quest for certainty, the search for archaic authorization that followed, it seems to highlight something fundamental about the human condition after the voices fell silent.
It really does. It underscores what seems to be an inherent discomfort with ambiguity and uncertainty in the conscious human mind, and perhaps the deep-seated psychological need to find external justification, grounding, or authority in a world no longer directly commanded by voices perceived as divine. Jaynes suggests that much of human religious, political, and philosophical history since the breakdown can be understood as various attempts, some successful, some disastrous, to fill that void, to find new sources of certainty and command, whether it's infallible scriptures, divine kings, rationalist philosophies, scientific laws, or political ideologies.
So the theory positions us, modern conscious humans, at a unique and perhaps precarious point in history. We've become, in a sense, our own authorization, tracing our decisions and volition primarily to our internal subjective I.
Yes. We experience ourselves as the authors of our thoughts and actions. But Jaynes implies we are often still struggling mightily with the immense implications and responsibilities of that state. The anxiety of free will, the burden of choice, the search for meaning in a universe that no longer speaks to us directly with divine commands. These are arguably the defining challenges of the conscious era. It's a humbling perspective, really, asking us to question the very nature of the most familiar, most intimate part of ourselves, our own conscious awareness.
Wow. Okay, we have taken a truly deep dive today into Julian Jaynes' theory of the bicameral mind. We've explored its audacious core claims, examined the incredibly wide-ranging evidence he marshaled from ancient texts, archaeology, neurology, and looked at the ongoing contemporary research from the Julian Jaynes Society that seeks to test and validate these ideas. And we've really grappled with its profoundly disruptive impact across so many fields.
It really is a theory that forces you to confront the possibility, however counterintuitive it feels, that the subjective inner world we inhabit, that continuous feeling of thinking and deciding inside a private mental space, might be a relatively recent, learned cultural construct, not an eternal biological aspect of simply being human.
And because of that, it provides a radically different lens, a completely different perspective through which to view human history, the achievements and practices of ancient civilizations, the origins of religion, the nature of phenomena like prophecy or possession, certain psychological conditions today, and even the very essence of volition, morality, and the self.
By systematically contrasting Jaynes' ideas with the dominant paradigms in psychology, neuroscience, and history, we can really see just how revolutionary, how challenging his intellectual project truly was and continues to be. It's a theory that doesn't just ask for a revision of details. It asks for a fundamental rethinking of our past, our present identity, and potentially even our future.
So the big question for you, listening right now, is what does all this mean for you? If consciousness, as Jaynes argues, is a cultural artifact, a magnificent but learned ability built precariously on language and metaphor, what does that imply for its future? Is our current state of mind the final destination? Could human mentality continue to change, perhaps evolving into something as different from our consciousness as ours is from the bicameral mind?
What other forms of mentation, what other ways of organizing reality and guiding action might be possible? Or might even lie dormant within us, perhaps beneath that surface layer of conscious narration, waiting for a different cultural key, a different set of linguistic tools, or maybe even different environmental pressures to unlock them?
These aren't easy questions, are they? And Jaynes certainly doesn't pretend to provide all the answers. But his theory, perhaps more powerfully than any other, gives us the framework and maybe the intellectual permission to ask them. To look at ourselves, our history, and our potential futures in a completely new and perhaps profoundly unsettling light.
It definitely encourages you to keep exploring, keep questioning everything you take for granted about your own mind.
Absolutely. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.